around the world that chose to have a very capacious understanding of Amoris Laetitia.
Hannah, I think you'll remember that you will always get a citation from Dr. Matthew Bunson.
Yeah.
That among the interpretations and implementations of it, the Malta Episcopal Conference, now it's not a very big Episcopal Conference, it's just a couple of bishops, but it was a very broad understanding of it. So that in some ways was the first indication that the future Cardinal Greck was very much on the program with Pope Francis.
Can you describe for our listeners and viewers the Amoris Laetitia document?
Yeah, well, specifically, obviously, this was a vast apostolic exhortation on family life. And it's a pity in many ways that Chapter 8 has become so controversial, because in that chapter, especially some footnotes, we've always joked that this is a pontificate of footnotes. Pope Francis discussed the possibility of a pastoral understanding of those couples who are divorced and remarried without an annulment, civil remarriage without an annulment, and is there a path for them to go back to receive communion? And obviously it was immensely controversial at the time. It remains one of the most controversial moments in the pontificate. So Cardinal Greck was soon brought to Rome and put in charge of the Synod of Bishops at exactly the time that Pope Francis really was reimagining the Synod of Bishops to have a much broader and significantly enhanced role in the life of the Church. And he has, I think, to his credit, certainly executed Francis's vision in that regard, especially in the implementation and the holding of the two synods on synodality, which was a multi-year process. So he demonstrates a capacity for organization. Some would question how well organized the instrumentum laboris was heading into it. I know you had the poor soul, you had to cover this and write about it. But then how the synod itself was conducted, there are obviously varying opinions on how successful he was in that. But as a presence who knows a lot of people and who is known by a lot of people, Cardinal Greck does check those boxes.
Monsignor Landry, I'm really keenly aware of the fact that because of the events of the last couple of days and what we're waiting for right now, you have audience members, listeners, faithful, who don't really know what church teaching is around those who are civilly divorced, married in the church, divorced, etc. Can you clarify that, just in case there's someone who does come to church or doesn't feel welcome at church or longs for the Eucharist?
There are multiple points of confusion that we can take on one at a time. First, just simply being divorced does not cut someone off for Holy Communion. If you were the cause of the divorce, a good confession might be in order. If you were the victim of a divorce, you have not lost the capacity to receive Holy Communion. There are many who are mistaken about that. For somebody who is in a state of divorce where his or her husband or wife is still alive, so still bound by the promises made to be married until death do they part, they would need to be free to marry somebody else in the church for them to continue to be able to receive Holy Communion. And so if they attempt, is the church's word, a civil remarriage without a declaration of nullity, they're making a very public act that's contrary to the teaching of the church, and they are, in those circumstances, still very much encouraged to come to Mass, still to pray, but they're no longer living the commitment that they made when they were sacramentally married. And we know as Catholics that the Mass is a spousal sacrament in which Jesus, the bridegroom of the church, gives himself to his bride, the church, and that would be contradicted by that second remarriage, which Jesus himself, not just his church, but Jesus says in the gospel, is tantamount to adultery. So in those circumstances, they cannot come and receive Holy Communion, but they're still very much a beloved member of the church. They're invited to come. We pray for some type of resolution, and the church always encourages in those circumstances not to be afraid to seek an annulment, because that church tribunal may determine that something necessary for a valid marriage was missing. Maybe there wasn't an openness to children. Maybe there was some type of major psychological block that was there. Who knows? The church pastorally wants to accompany everybody in these circumstances. But sometimes the individuals need to be courageous enough to trust in the Lord and give that a shot. About 90% of those couples in the United States that look into the validity of their first marriage get an outcome in which the church sees that something essential for marriage was missing. And then when they receive that declaration of nullity, they can approach their pastor, prepare for marriage, and then marry in the church and be restored to full communion. I have had the chance as a pastor of 2 parishes to accompany over 100 people on that journey, and it's so beautiful after somebody has faithfully persevered in the faith without receiving Holy Communion after 10, 12, sometimes 30 years to be able to receive Jesus anew. It's so much more powerful for them even than their first Holy Communion.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful to watch. For me personally, it was beautiful to experience the embrace of the church after that moment. And for a lot of people, they wonder, is it expensive? Oh, it takes too long. How did annulments change under this last pontificate?
So Pope Francis simplified the whole processes for an annulment, and he emphasized that annulments should be free. Now, in the United States, I know that not every diocese has gotten that memo. Somehow the tribunal staff has got to be paid, and I've been scandalized, to be blunt, by some dioceses and archdioceses who charge money for annulments, sometimes $750 and then others. It's not thousands of dollars. I've seen that in other countries in the world, but Pope Francis once wanted very much to say that the church is there to help you. We're not trying to make money to pay for overhead or things like that, and that was his emphasis. The second is he created a new process, which was a very brief process when the church is able to see right off the bat that something essential was obviously missing. And in circumstances like that, rather than the typical 1.5-year process, which is average in the church for this investigation, it could be done within a few months much more clearly. Many others could receive what we call a form case annulment, not to get too much into the weeds, but if a Catholic marries outside the church without the bishop's permission, that marriage is invalid from the start. It is not a situation in which Jesus Christ is joining us to somebody else. And so for somebody who was engaged in that and suffered divorce thereafter, all you'd need to do is produce some documents, baptismal certificates, marriage certificates, final divorce decrees, etc., and a little bit of paperwork, and then the church can declare summarily that there was an annulment, that marriage was null from the beginning, and then the person would be free to marry someplace else.
Well, I hope that any bishops listening do take that to heart, knowing that sometimes the obstacles which are temporal really shouldn't be obstacles for what someone is trying to do in embracing church teaching and really receiving the greatest thing in the world, which is Jesus Christ in the Eucharist. Colum is ready and wants to share a little bit more with us about what he's hearing and what he's personally feeling too, and then we'll go back to our discussion on Cardinal Greck. Colum, what are you seeing?
Monsignor, I'm after bumping into a gentleman here, but he's scooting. He's on a scooter.
Yes.
It's difficult to scoot in this crowd.
Now, yes, but if you go over there at the crowd, there is a little
Opening.
bit. Yes, it's
So
opening.
then you're running. So you're Italian, you're a Catholic. What do you think of what's happening at the moment, this moment in history?
We are waiting for the new Pope,
Yes.
the election of the new Pope.
How do you feel?
I feel amazing. I'm waiting for it.
And are you surprised by how many people are here watching that chimney?
No, I'm not surprised.
You're not surprised?
Every time is like this.
It's like
very
this.
crowded. Yes, every time.
Isn't it amazing? It shows you just how powerful the church is to touch people all over the world, to come here to witness this
Yes,
moment.
because Pope and
Well, I think we lost audio like we were saying. There is tough connectivity issues. There's so many people here. Again,
Well,
I
also,
blame the
too,
Starlinks.
because of the security, the dampening
That's
of the
true.
security across this entire area as part of the security for the conclave. The reality is, many of us up here, for example,
We don't
on
have cell
set-
connection. Yeah, we cannot talk
Exactly.
to our families right now.
Well, as long as we can connect with all of you, but that security, I mean,
It's
it's
real.
going to be rough couple of days for people who wander into this part of the world. And I have the feeling that probably by the end of the night, Cullum will be in the Piazza Navona talking to
With some gelato, I
With
hope.
some gelato.
Some really, really good gelato. Well, I mean, our discussion on Cardinal Greck, I think, led us into a beautiful teaching moment, a catechetical moment, especially, again, I have a heart for this. I think it's really important for people to know that the church loves them and wants to embrace them, and that there are opportunities for them to encounter their priest. If you don't get a good answer there, go to your bishop. He should be receiving you with open arms. So, back to Cardinal Greck.
Yes.
When we think about him and what was discussed, the idea of synodality, sure, but someone who can run Vatican affairs, someone who can be the face of the church to evangelize and communicate the church with the world. This 69-year-old cardinal, do I have his age right? I believe so. Does he check those boxes?
He was a very successful parish priest and bishop of the smaller island in Malta. So there are 2 islands in Malta, the main island, and then
Gozo.
I think.
Gozo
Yes.
is the second island. Malta is an incredibly Catholic place. There are gorgeous churches everywhere. The people are faithful, including to daily mass in high numbers. And so it's a circumstance that somewhat makes it easier for parish priests and bishops when there are so many faithful practicing. And he had the reputation for being the bishop of the 2 bishops there, far more aligned with Pope Benedict when he was named than the bishop on the other island. And so Pope Francis persuaded him to come here and head up the synod. And most of the people who knew him as the Bishop of Gozo were a little bit surprised with some of the positions he's taken since he's come here, because he had a reputation of being far more conservative than his being progressive here as the head of the synod. And so he has a good pastoral reputation from his past as a pastor and a bishop in Gozo.
You know, the very question of synodality, which, as we know, has been a fraught topic for a number of years now, where it's almost difficult even to define today what exactly it is. So Cardinal Greck, and I would add to that Cardinal Jean-Claude Hollerich of Luxembourg, those 2 are tied intimately together in terms of the Synod on Synodality. He is essentially the face of the Synod on Synodality now that Pope Francis is no longer with us. That is a source of encouragement for some in the college, but for others who have been concerned with the direction of the Synod, but also how it's going to be implemented, I think that could prove something of a deficit for him.
Hannah, what can you tell us about Cardinal Hollerich and the way that he could be providing some support for Cardinal Greck, even just a little bit of background on him in general, just in case our audience doesn't know him very well?
Right, so he's the only cardinal and archbishop of Luxembourg, a very small country in Europe. So he wasn't, I would say, so well known, although he has taken on leadership roles within the European bishops, and so he's had some visibility that way. But the synod for him became as well a very important moment, as he was given one of the most important jobs by Pope Francis himself as the relator. So he had a very important as well speaking role to all those who participated in the synod. So he would, at the beginning of each week of the most recent monthly meeting, he would provide an introduction. This is what we're going to discuss this week. Here are sort of the ground rules. Obviously, he, spoke a lot to media as well, was answering questions that we had about the process as it was ongoing and the different documents that were included. That has certainly risen his figure.
Well, what else can we add then about when you have a backer and what that looks like, to have Cardinal Hollerich kind of creating relationships and maybe making introductions that he, individuals that he encountered with the Synod? We know that Bishop Barron was explaining that he encountered 60 or so cardinals through that process. Might that be helpful to Cardinal Greck?
Exactly. So the Synod brought together cardinals from all over the world in these 2 different synods. Now, it was largely the same group for each year, but that is a very interesting group because it was fairly diverse. You know, Pope Francis himself added a number of significant cardinals to that. The other aspect about Cardinal Hollerich that's worth noting is that he spent a great deal of time in Asia. He served in Japan and was closely tied to the Jesuit institutions there, being a Jesuit himself. That is a connection, I think, that can also benefit should he have chosen. We don't know who Cardinal Hollerich at the end of the day is going to be disguising his handwriting and picking to be the next pope in his ballot. But I think if there is this continuation of synodality, Cardinal Hollerich, who is very clearly invested in this, I think would see Cardinal Greck as one of the best options for continuing it in exactly the mode that Pope Francis wanted.
And that's not necessarily something that we've seen expressed as a desire in these general congregations. We heard a lot of a desire for continuity of all three pontificates, but Cardinal Czerny, in an interview that I think was quite popular in the Italian press and then in global press, saying we want a successor to the seat of Peter, not necessarily a successor to Pope Francis. Right, Monsignor Landry?
That's the way it always has to be. As a factual matter, he will be the successor of Francis and all the popes all the way back to Peter. There's been this transmission of the keys, apostolic succession, tracing all the way back to the upper room, tracing all the way back to Caesarea Philippi when Jesus promised those keys to Peter. What I think's important to talk about with Cardinal Greck with regard to the 62 cardinals who were members of the synod is not every one of those cardinals was an enthusiastic supporter of the synod. And so even though they were all there and got to know him, many were resistant to some of what was going on in the synod, and for that reason, Cardinal Greck might be among the most unpopular figures.
Well, we'll see. I think we won't know.
We will.
And whatever it is that someone tells us, hopefully won't get them excommunicated, since we know that's the penalty for talking about the conclave and the goings-on within it, even in the general congregations. Well, let's talk about another candidate that's less well-known, but that has come up quite a few times in these conversations, and that's Cardinal Lopez Romero. Although we can say his name in Spanish, he's not necessarily from Spain. Talk to us about him, Matthew.
Well, that's right. So he is in his 70s. He is a cardinal from Catalan. So he has that Spanish connection. He's a Salesian. Mm-hmm. He has served in South America, so he has the direct connection with Latin America. And then he was sent, of all places, to Rabat, in Morocco, to serve, and has really established himself as somebody who, in much the same way that Cardinal Jean-Marc Aveline in Marseille, is somebody who spans almost the whole of the Mediterranean. So that includes Spain, it includes, of course, North Africa, down into sub-Saharan Africa, but a little less than one would think. And then, of course, into southern Europe, into France and into Italy. So that area, that geographical area, would likely be one of the bases for his support, especially his connections to Latin America in his time there.
So he does check that box of ethnicity, diversity, and understanding different cultures, bringing to the table an understanding of the East as well, which we know was discussed many, many times. The Eastern churches wanting representation, but also as a bit of a passion project that Pope Francis brought forward, and we saw it certainly reflected in his funeral. What would you add, Monsignor Landry?
Well, he brings the experience of 3 different continents, his serving for 20 years as a missionary in Paraguay, and then going back and heading the Salesians in Honduras. The Latin Americans know they're not going to get another Latin American. So what they're really hoping for is somebody with great Latin American experience so that they can bring the needs, they can bring the hopes of those in Latin America to the See of St. Peter, just like Jorge Mario Bergoglio had. And so he is one who checks in big, thick, bold marker that continental hope. I think also he's one of many Salesian cardinals. And so when there have been questions made of other Salesian cardinals, like, for example, Cardinal Angel Fernandez Artim, when people have been sort of trying to prop him up as a potential candidate for the papacy, he says, no, I'm supporting another Salesian. And he's trying to prop up his brother. And so there are a lot of Salesian cardinals. Part of that goes back not just to St. John Bosco, the founder of the Salesians, but also to Cardinal Tarcisio Bertone, who was here as a Salesian, as a Secretary of State, who was at least availing himself of the skills of a lot of other Salesians, putting them in places of success, mentioning them in these areas so that they would be able to be spotted, placed into these sees that could then become cardinalatial. And so the Cardinal of Rabat is giving lots of interviews. When a lot of other people were tight-lipped over the course of this week, he was regularly giving Spanish interviews. And compelling interviews, in a sense, from his experience. This is a person who's clearly a disciple of Jesus Christ. He looks like a Christian. He walks like a Christian. He talks like a Christian. And it's made people wonder whether he could be the successor of St. Peter, because he does come from the peripheries. Just his 20 years in Paraguay and then Honduras would be
That's
bringing the real concerns of indigenous and poor people, much like Pope Francis did, but not from a place like Buenos Aires, but from the places of the Guarani.
Yes, and I think that does play a really significant role when you're thinking about what he'll bring to the table, the kind of connections he'll be able to make with other cardinals, and how he'll be able to really be a place to receive the needs that we know all cardinals come with. When that person switches from being my brother cardinal to the Holy Father, they're going to try to make that connection. Hannah, as a member of the press, have you experienced that and seen that openness on his behalf?
Sure. I'm sorry. I'm just a little distracted by the young people.
The young people are yelling. It's
There's
loud.
young people walking by the set, and they're excited to be here. No, I mean, of course, that transition from cardinal to pope, there has to be that switch from the leader of a particular church to the leader of the universal church, right? So that's an important step, and it'll be interesting to see whoever is elected, how they make that step.
And they'll be qualified by the Holy Spirit in cooperation with the Holy Spirit if they're prayerful.
Yeah, so it's one of the fun things to ponder, what name different cardinals might take if they became pope. One of the names, for example, with Cardinal Jean Aveline of Marseille, is that were he elected pope, it's been assumed that he would take John the 24th because he looks kind of like John. I say that because it is assumed almost that he probably wouldn't, but were Lopez Romero to be elected pope, everyone in their minds would think this is Francis II. And I say that because he embodies so many of the different aspects of the Francis pontificate. The focus on the Mediterranean, the focus on migration. He has dealt with that himself. He is in the Mediterranean, so he's very familiar with the crisis at Lampedusa, for example. When Pope Francis made his first trip, it was to the island of Lampedusa where thousands of migrants have died trying to reach. He is somebody who is also very much concerned with the environment, with climate change. He's Laudato Si. He is also somebody who sees the importance of synodality. He has spoken very favorably of it. And he represents, I think, this vision of continuity with the Francis pontificate. So those who would be supporting him would see that as one of the biggest reasons to support him, to continue the Francis vision for the church. As
a missionary church with big pastoral outreach, but also, I would say, particularly because of where he is and where he's from, an understanding of interreligious dialogue, especially around issues with Islam and Muslim-majority countries.
He has spoken publicly that Pope Francis appointed him as a cardinal for interreligious dialogue, and that Pope Francis appointed many cardinals precisely to be able to have that existential conversation. Interreligious dialogue is not just of words, or it's certainly not carried out mainly among theologians. But as Pope Benedict got the whole church moving in this direction, he said it's carried out by works of charity. It's carried out by this existential dialogue. He used to use the word caminar juntos in Spanish, that real interreligious dialogue begins with walking together, just sharing life together, recognizing the humanity in each other, etc. And so Lopez Romero is somebody who has been making that journey for many years, believes in it, and wants the church moving ahead to be able to do that more concertedly.
Well, he's also a cardinal with a beard, and we'll have a conversation about bearded cardinals in a second. We're all sitting here waiting. It's now been over 2 hours, which in my mind gives enough time for a lengthy exhortation. 133, I'm doing the math in my head on how long it takes for them to deliver their ballot, and then for the scrutineers to come in and do their job. So hopefully we're getting close. But
don't forget the revisers.
The revisers, right. We check it, and then we check it again. And we still haven't confirmed whether we're having an infirmari take part or not, which I'm sure we'll be able to maybe suss out. Maybe Hannah can figure that out for us.
We didn't see any of the cardinals needing assistance today, which I
thought
was...
That's right. In the procession or in professing their oath. So that's very true. Thank you so much, Dr. Bunsen. But let's go out to Column and see if this anticipation has, a couple of people kind of just feeling that. But before we do that, I think it is important for us to reflect on the spirituality of these men with a little bit of a different angle. Cardinal Greck, and I would say because of the issue of synodality and the listening, would have carried on that spirit of interreligious dialogue, as you were mentioning it, that was so important to Pope Francis, but made some people uncomfortable. How secure do people have to be in their faith, and how clear do they have to be in communicating it in order to be able to engage in this interreligious dialogue? I spent 15 years of my life defending religious freedom, but very clearly understanding that that isn't about where the faiths come together, but really about where the faiths differ and strengthening each other in those differences rather than trying to find places that water down our religious beliefs.
So we need to make a very important distinction about what faith is. Faith is first and foremost a trust in someone on the basis of which you trust in what that person has said and done. So for us as Catholics, we trust in Jesus Christ, and therefore, because of that trust, we believe in the resurrection, as he said in his conversation with Martha and Mary after Lazarus' death. Because we trust in Jesus, we believe in what he says about the Eucharist, as happened in Capernaum. When a Catholic has that type of trust in Jesus, the person might not be the smartest potential theologian in carrying on conversations about God 1 versus 3, which is a common conversation that Catholics would have, for example, with Muslims. But if somebody really deeply believes in Jesus, then they can have the dialogue of charity, they can have the dialogue of friendship, they can just give witness to the massive impact his own friendship with Christ or her own friendship makes in life, which is one of the most powerful ways to share the faith. If somebody likewise knows the content of the faith, like a Dr. Matthew Bunson, then you're able to have conversations that are far more theological and start to poke holes. For example, again, if we're continuing the conversation about Muslims, about how the Quran was put together, about the lack of real scrutiny for some of the things that are in there, about the internal contradiction that you'll find there. But you don't have to know the Christian faith well enough to engage in that type of conversation. I remember the joke of the stubborn Irishman having a conversation in a bar, and he's getting basically killed in forensic debating points. But at the end, he just slams down his pint and he says, "You may have all the arguments, but you're still wrong." Because he knew Jesus, who has risen from the dead and accompanies him in life, and eventually he'll discover, if he works at it, the types of arguments that would be the proper retort.
And personal conviction really does matter. That really is the best communicator of the faith, which is one of the reasons why you want that personal witness and fire, that consuming fire, to be shared. And you want the person leading the church to have that inside of them so that they can preach and engage others in this way. Interreligious dialogue then becomes a little tricky when you're trying to figure out who's who among these candidates.
It does very much. And someone like Lopez Romero was a big supporter, as we all have been saying, of Pope Francis, in particular in the area of interreligious dialogue as it pertains to one of the other side projects. It was still a major project, the idea of fraternity. When you read Pope Francis's encyclical Fratelli